welcome everyone back to the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. We are so excited to have you with us today. We have our guest, Natalie Jenner, who is also new ambassador with the foundation. We're so excited to have you here and with the foundation. So hi, Natalie, how are you?
Oh, hi, Melissa. I'm great, and I'm thrilled to be here, and particularly thrilled to have been asked to be an ambassador for the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation and share my story today. So thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. Why don't we just go ahead and start off right out of the gate with what was reading to you as a child? Were you a big reader? Was it not something that you did a lot? How did you feel?
Yeah, well, my books are like not the ones I read when I was little. There's a little children's bookcase over there. It's just like I've kept every book I ever got as a gift, every book that I loved. I was a voracious reader. I was an early reader. I think I was reading by the time I was 3. And my mother says that I wanted to be a writer even before that moment. Like she said, there was something about just like a blank piece of paper going, she said, like, you didn't know any words yet, like you hardly talk, but you wanted to write. And I was, a bookworm. I went to the library constantly. I always had like a thing of many books on the go next to my bedside, and still to this day known among all my friends that I grew up with and went to school with. Like they just reminisce about like you were always had your nose in a book. And it's been probably the greatest long love of my life. Very, very important to me. Yeah.
That's so special that you still have your books from your childhood. Is there any book in particular that like really stood out to you?
Yeah, I seemed to be really into spying when I was little. So I loved all the Enid Blyton Secret 7 and Famous 5. And then in North America, we know Encyclopedia Brown. Do you ever
Yeah.
know? Oh, yeah, love Encyclopedia Brown. Loved Harriet the Spy. Anything where somebody was surreptitiously watching the rest of the world, I seem to love. I also really, really loved Anna Green Gables because of the celebration of her imaginative spirit and her autonomy and her authenticity as I think as a character, as a young woman. And I discovered Jane Austen when I was 9. So Jane quickly took the lead as like my lifelong, favorite author. Yeah.
So let's segue perfectly into what is your favorite Austen novel?
Probably Your First Love is, always, the love that you have the most emotional kind of response to. So Pride and Prejudice was the first one that I read, and I loved right away when I read her, that first page. I felt like it was like her voice was in my head. It just resonated with, honestly, the marrow of my bones. It was this incredible feeling. I felt it a few times with a few other writers like Edith Wharton and Henry James. But like I said, she got to me first, and she's lasted the longest. She never goes out of style for me. And Pride and Prejudice is my favorite because it's the one that makes me probably the happiest throughout, and the one that makes me laugh the most. But Persuasion and Emma duke it out for second, and the 3 of them toggle around depending on my mood as well. So sometimes people have asked me and I've said Persuasion, and then other times I've said Emma. But I think Pride and Prejudice because it was the first.
And how many times have you reread Pride and Prejudice, do you think, over the years? And do you feel like it's completely different experience? Like reading it as a 9-year-old, I can't imagine to reading it today you get so much different experience.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Melissa. I think the experience of reading Jane Austen I think it was one of her descendants that said, or relations that said that as you read her and through your life, you grow with her growth and strengthen with her strengths. And I really felt that when I was in my 20s, how I saw Pride and Prejudice start to shift as I started to become settled and a parent myself through my 30s. I've enjoyed it in the same way probably since my 20s, but as a young person, what I really loved, like when I was 9 and through my teens, what I really loved about Pride and Prejudice was how I could relate to these crazy family dynamics. I was the oldest of 3 kids. My parents had a similar marriage. I think everyone's marriage, frankly, is kind of like the Bennet in a weird way. Is there a fraction of that? But I remember really relating to the family dynamics, and then to that concept of who was going to be the one? What would that man, what would that person, that partner be like for you? So I remember when I was young, really loving that whole Mr. Darcy trope. And then as an adult, really appreciating it on many other levels as well. So yeah.
So obviously Jane Austen had a huge influence on your life, and you did become a writer, as your mom, I'm sure, would have maybe predicted from you
Yeah.
scratching on all the paper.
Yeah.
And your book just exploded. You have the Jane Austen Society, which is an amazing book. And I feel like correct me if I'm wrong, it came out.
Over a year ago.
Okay, I read an early copy, so I wasn't sure. I couldn't remember exactly when it.
You would
When
have
it,
read that 2 years ago, possibly.
yeah. So that story now during the pandemic, I feel like just really speaks to people. And what kind of catapulted you into deciding you needed to tell this story?
Well, I really did back end into it. I had tried for decades to be a writer, and I think any writers watching who aren't published, I mean, it's decades of rejection, and you go through periods where you just give up. It's just easier to not deal with the rejection. And I quit for good when I was 40, and then when I was 50, I was going through a challenging time in life with my husband's health. And the thing that was giving me the most solace by far was rereading Austen, which I've done regularly. But this time when I was rereading her, I was getting something special from her. And I say to people, it was like she had been waiting for me to catch up to her, and that she had had this challenging life as a woman at a time without much agency, a lot of homelessness, unsettlement, uncertainty. And now I was in a similar state of uncertainty about the future. How much time did I have with my husband? It was very worrying at that moment in my life. So I was starting to relate to her books and the theme of grief, the shadow story in her books of the loss of a parent triggering the plot, or the fear of the loss of Mr. Bennet causing Mrs. Bennet to act the way she does. It's in all those books. And I remember starting to respond to her books as a way of comfort through grief. And so that was the light bulb moment, I think. I took a trip to Chawton because I'd always wanted to get inside Chawton House, and I'd never been able to visit it, although I'd visited the Jane Austen House Museum. And walking in her footsteps there and being in Chawton House and the museum in September of 2017 was this really visceral experience. I think as a writer really got into my DNA and like really started to kind of like percolate. And so then a few months went by, and one day my daughter says, I looked up and I said, I'm going to write again. And they're all like, God, don't do it. I was like, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to write for me and for Daddy. And I'm going to write about Jane Austen and all the things I love about her. And I had done this year of reading her and reading about her, and it was like a big soup in my brain. And Melissa, the funny thing is that I'd read dozens of books about her, and books, her books over and over again in order. When I sat down to write this book, I don't plot or outline. So I had no idea what I type a word, I don't know what the next word is. Something is guiding my hands. It's automatic writing, basically. It's more intentional than that because my thoughts are faster than my typing. So I can edit as I go. But I remember I wrote it 2,000 words a day, day after day, 5-6 weeks, first draft. The research took a year. The research was behind me when I started to write. And I never went back because I didn't really know what I was doing. So I kind of let it just sort of sit on my shoulder and whisper in my ear a bit like an angel. And that was the jet fuel was very hidden from me as I wrote this book. I was very inspired by my trip to Chawton and incredibly inspired by Jane Austen. And I went with it. And I was so happy at the end. I was really, really proud of this book.
I love that's such a beautiful story. I can just picture you sitting there and typing away and these ideas just flowing through you.
These characters just coming to me, and they always do that. They always just show up. And when they show up, I have another friend, an author, who said she has the same experience. They just show up in a doorway or on a bench, and they're like, oh, there you are. I'm so glad you finally showed up. I'm so happy to meet you. It's a gift to be able to be a writer. And it's a gift to have those moments.
That's beautiful. Were there any books that really stood out to you as you were researching for the project? And can you give us kind of an idea of how many books do you think you read as you're getting ready to write something?
Oh, it's funny because I think with some books that I write, I might, because I think I'm working on my 9th book now, but I only have one published and then one more getting published next year. But there's I think 6 in a drawer at least. It will be anywhere from intensively reading 3 books to dozens, and it will depend. So with some books, I just need the inspiration from the reading. With other books, like with the Jane Austen Society, although it was not intentional research, I was reading dozens of books because I didn't know I was going to write about certain things. I was just fascinated by the idea of I want to learn as much about her as possible because it just made me feel good to be near her. thinking about her in her world. So I read really, really excessively. So ironically, I think that's why there's so much in the Jane Austen Society. There's like so much buried in there, a lot of Easter eggs, a lot of allusions, and things that are not that obvious maybe to everybody. But I know like there's so many different books behind my book. And some of the ones that particularly inspired me are Carolyn's book, Jane and Me, because I bought that in the gift shop during my trip to Chawton House. And I came home and I read it. And when I read that book, I remember going, this is a book about a family in a house. And they happen to be related to Jane Austen. But what it's really about is not just honoring the legacy of Jane Austen, but also the legacy of these homes that are very difficult to keep up, and paying attention to them, and as a family doing their best to keep it going and to honor, you know, this incredible legacy that they'd inherited. And so it was both part of and separate from Jane Austen. And I found it incredibly inspirational. So looking back, that was probably one of 2 or 3 key books for this book that got me thinking about the house and a family in the house, a fictionalized family of the Knights from like the 1860s onwards, but what the toll, pressure, stresses, strains, and beauty of having a home like that.
Your book, the characters feel so real. It's hard to remember that, you know, this is a story that you created, and I'm like, want to Google them and find these people. So you did a really great job bringing the humanity to them. And like you said, to the Knights living in the house, it's more than just family connected to Jane Austen. It's truly their stories also.
Yeah.
Did you feel that connection? What was the experience like reading when you were in Chawton House?
When I was in the building itself,
Yes.
I remember everything. I wanted to go for years, like probably, oh my goodness, like over 15 years since it had opened. And we had never been in Chawton on the days that the house was open. And on this trip, I remember rushing over the minute I arrived in Alton and checked into my hotel, and I rushed over to Chawton. I went to the museum because it's the first thing you hit when you're walking from Alton. And I went in and I saw her little table and everything. But when I got into Chawton House, everything was so new to me. I had not gone online and researched anything or had any idea what to expect. And I remember walking into the dining room in particular, with the big table there of Edward Austen Knight and his family, his 11 children, and Jane and Cassandra were probably sat around that. And I remember the window seats. And when you look out the window seat, you can see that front drive. I remember thinking about that this house was kind of a little bit like Emma Woodhouse's house, you know, in Highbury. Like it had that feeling of the stately home set back from the road and the rest of the village rotating around it and supporting it. And its essential role in the town of support. And I remember being in these rooms and thinking about how I could literally picture Jane in that reading nook that's above the front door, looking out, wondering, oh, who's coming? Like I'm trying to read, I'm trying to write, like just sort of feeling her presence. And so it was incredibly inspirational. And everything I saw that first day in the 2 hours that I got there, so I got there at 3 and they close at 5, everything I saw that day is in a scene in my book.
Oh, wow.
I pay homage to every single thing. Yeah.
It's so amazing too how you can have a book and read it in a new location or read it at a different age, or I like to buddy read with friends and have a new experience every time you read the same book. It just kind of like lives these different lives as we go on with them.
I think, yeah, sorry, I think books are very much they're a lot about the reader as well as the author. And in fact, one of my friends said to me that once you publish the book, once the book is published, it's no longer yours, it belongs to the readers. And I think there is so much work to be done in reading a book, with language, with decoding, and with the density of the art form. You know, with a movie, it's so visual, it's so easy to absorb, or music, to hear a beautiful passage. But with reading, there's an interaction that you have to do if you're lucky enough to be educated, to be able to read and to break down so much density in the text, which as an English literature student at university, I appreciate and love. And I think that that act of decoding and breaking down bonds you with the art. And I think it also is the art form that puts you most into the consciousness of the artist. Like you are in someone else's mind as you write. And we all know how busy our minds are and how much there's always going on. And I think when you read, I think you're getting a window into the busyness of the author's mind as well. And I think that is part of the magic of reading.
Yeah. And literacy has played a huge part in your life. You have some work that you've done with literacy. Could you tell us a little bit about your past?
Yeah, well, I was very lucky to be able to study English at university and to then go on to law school. And when I was a young lawyer, I would volunteer at a literacy center in Toronto, the East End Literacy Center. And it was something I did once a week because I knew how much books had given me in my life. And I thought, and I still believe, that if books haven't been a big part of your life, you can't conceive of how big a part they could be. It's like a part that's cut off from you. And that's why when people do love to read, they're usually voracious about it, because it can be wonderfully consuming and it can provide you with an entire lifetime and more of enjoyment and stimulation in a fairly affordable way if you are lucky to live near a library. And I remember very much feeling very like sadness that there were so many people that would not only not have literacy skills that I've been lucky to get through education, but that might even be hiding that a little bit, right? And trying to get through life, and they're not getting the help that they need because they might feel a sense of otherness or differentness from others by not being able to read. And so I've very much wanted to, in my own small way, help my community that way. And it's why I'm so excited to be an ambassador for the foundation, because I think that it is the one common, universal, basic, besides food and water and a roof over your head, to be able to read opens up the world for you like nothing else.
Absolutely. So important for kids to have that reading foundation to grasp every subject that they're working on in school.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we end, if you want to give us a little tidbit about your new book going to be coming out. I've seen the pictures, the drawings, the sketches online, and I am really excited because it's bookshop.
Yeah, I used to own my own little bookshop actually, because I'm always just trying to brainwash people into reading what I love to read. And I wrote this book fully in pandemic on lockdown because of my husband's lung disease. We don't leave. And I wrote it fully inside. And how lucky was I to have access to resources and the internet and everything else during this terrible time around the world, that I could do my research from home. And it's called Bloomsbury Girls. And continues the story of one of the characters from the Jane Austen Society, Evie Stone, the servant girl. And it brings her into a bookshop in 1950s London. And there's a battle of the sexes going on between the male department heads and the women employees. And it's very much about classism and what is women's literature and writing and how we write, the different ways that we write, because some of the staff were frustrated secret writers. And I was channeling a lot of the experience of getting published finally into this. And it's a book I wrote when I was really happy, regardless of the difficult circumstances we were in. We're still being very blessed and lucky in our situation. And it's pretty much completely set in the bookshop in the winter spring of 1950. So historically a really interesting time where women were starting to have to reclaim a lot of the independence that they experienced during the war. And some time has gone by and the world always tends to settle back to where it was. And it's a really wonderful, I think, story of empowerment. So, but it's really fun. I'm doing my copy edits today and it still makes me smile.
So excited to be reading that, hopefully soon, as you're working on your edits now.
Yeah, the galleys come out. I think the arcs will be out probably later this fall. So yeah, it comes out next May 17th, 2022 from St. Martin's Press in North America. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, I'm sure I'll be very eager to read that by the time it releases. Thank you so much, Natalie. It was a real pleasure to speak with you today. And thank you again for joining the foundation as an ambassador in our efforts to create awareness for literacy and just bring the joy of reading to more people's lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa and Carolyn, for inviting me. And everyone stay safe and well out there. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.